Asyle, the Engineer, and the Island. Week 51, Day 1. It was another clear day today, which kind of makes me wonder if the wet season is starting to come to an end. Whatever the case, I wasn't going to let it go to waste, so after doing my morning chores and separating my microbe cultures, I took the copper ore I mined last week and started smelting. I also pulled the copper from the prototype Electrofuge, which I'd been collecting for 11 days. It had grown too thick to reasonably use as a sheet anyway, and I could see little bits of silver collecting on the tips of the spiky crystals that had grown from the surface of the cells, telling me that the plate was probably getting so thick that it was beginning to pick up the wrong band of metals. Regardless, it was still great news for me, because these plates probably had as much copper in them as a couple days worth of mining, so I should have just enough to build the rest of the Electrofuge coils, and could look forward to having plenty more to work with in the future. I pulled most of the molten copper into fairly thin wire, since the current passing through most of them didn't need to be very large, and I saved a little for thin copper plates I could use to build another potentiometer for tuning the system. It took a little longer than usual because there was so much copper to pull. I stopped for lunch when I was done with the copper, and then proceeded to build a batch of resistors to control the coil's current, and put them in the solar kiln to set while the sun was still out. I then spent an hour or so building the potentiometer. Finally, I had just about everything I needed to begin building and testing the full-scale Electrofuge. It took several trips to bring all the parts I'd need down to the bottom of the shaft, and by that time, I was exhausted and not sure if I had time to assemble everything. So instead, I used some of the copper wire to replace the power lines I dug up for the prototype Electrofuge coil a couple of weeks ago, and spent an hour or so resting in my office, fixing the stuff I wasn't happy with in my writing yesterday. Week 51, Day 2. It was still pretty nice out today, which made me worried that the rising temperatures and dropping pressures were going to bring in another big storm, but it may just be that everything's warming up evenly as this hemisphere starts tilting back towards the sun. However, as much as I wanted to get to work on the Electrofuge, I felt like I needed to take advantage of the sunshine while I had it. I was starting to run low on paper, and I'd completely run out of lime from building the Electrofuge tower down in the shaft, so I reluctantly stayed above ground today, and loaded sand into the solar kiln for lime production between my morning chores and microbe processing. After lunch, I took some of the lime I made today, and while still keeping the kiln loaded, I worked on paper production for the remainder of the afternoon. While I was working, a pleasant thought crossed my mind, namely that there should be a lot of calcium in the Earth's crust, and my Electrofuge should be able to pull it out as calcium hydroxide or calcium sulfate, either of which I can convert into lime, calcium oxide, without having to raid the beach for it anymore, which will certainly be a relief. Plus, this should be much more eco-friendly than cooking the carbon dioxide out of calcium carbonate. Week 51, Day 3. Nope, still pretty sunny today. Again, I'm not sure if the weather is playing a joke on me or not, now that I want an excuse to spend a day underground. I wasn't going to let that stop me, though, because instead of doing another day of lime production, I loaded up some superoxide into the kiln in the morning and let it cook for the day. Then, after my morning chores, microbe separation, and lunch, I finally headed back down into the caves and began building the full-scale Electrofuge apparatus. I had to start by taking apart everything I'd already built and plugging up the reservoir so it wouldn't keep producing steam. In the process, I could see that the resin my poor Tesla turbine was made of had really started to dissolve into a horrible black goop that had begun gumming up the pipes, so that wouldn't have worked for much longer anyway. It did a good job while I had it, though. Next, I got to work installing the individual cells and rotors, which had to stack in a particular order and thread onto the axle pipe as I went. This'll make maintenance a pain if anything breaks, unfortunately, because I'll have to take the whole thing apart in that order as well. Once all the cells were in place, I assembled the new turbine, reusing the generator, flyball, and belt systems from the old one for speed control and maximized power output. Finally, I hooked up the coils to the rectifier on the generator, adding resistors based on my best estimates for the magnetic field strength requirements for each element, and opened the reservoir so the water could start flowing again. I ran into a little problem, though, in that there was more water trickling down from the electrolysis cells than could reach and refill the reservoir. As a result, only steam managed to reach the turbine, but this at least gave me an opportunity to calibrate its speed before bed, which I set to about 360 RPM, or a tangential velocity of about 3 meters per second for the rotors. Unfortunately, that was all I really had time for today. Tomorrow, I'll need to collect sulfuric acid from the caldera to fill up the system. Week 51, Day 4. I was fully expecting the joke to resume, and for it to rain today, but it was still pretty clear out. Nothing to get in the way of acid collection today except my own fatigue from running up and down the mountain, and of course my morning chores and microbial studies. Once again, I was only able to get started after lunch. It probably would have been easier if I'd built a pipeline and used a little suction to pull the acid over the lip of the caldera and down the rest of the way into the tunnels, but that would have been more trouble than it was worth, and I didn't actually need a lot of it, just enough to fill up the electrofuge, and I shouldn't need to refill it often after that. That meant it was just a day of grunt work, taking pots up to the caldera, filling them up, and bringing them down to the northern entrance of the cave system. Fortunately, after that, though, I could use my wheelbarrow to carry them the rest of the way to the shaft. I just had to be careful not to spill the acid on myself, so I was extremely careful to monitor my fatigue levels so I wouldn't slip during the hike. I spent most of the remainder of the afternoon on this, and as I went, I could hear the turbine really start to rev up. When the thing seemed to be pretty much filled up at the end of the day, I double-checked the power output and made sure that the voltages on the plates and coils and the rotational velocities on the drums were where I wanted them to be before getting ready for bed. Week 51, Day 5. When I got up in the morning, I went to check on the electrofuge, as I expected it would still need calibration. Already I could see iron collecting on 2 different levels of plates, which told me I needed to adjust the magnetic field strengths on those coils, and I marked each electrofuge stack so I would remember which ones were supposed to hold which element. I suppose it wasn't really surprising that I was collecting iron so soon, as it's one of the most abundant metals in the Earth's crust. Silica, unsurprisingly, composes about 75% of the Earth's crust, followed by aluminum at 8%, iron at 5%, calcium at 4%, and sodium, magnesium, and potassium at about 2% each. The rest are in trace amounts of less than 1%, but this particular island seems to have a higher concentration of these rarer elements than the rest of the crust, like copper, sulfur, zinc, and like lead, probably because it's located over that hot spot in the mantle, where heavier elements may be drawn up from the Earth's outer core by convection. If it takes about a day to collect a full plate of iron from the Electrofuge, and about a week to collect a full plate of copper, that would suggest that the relative abundance of these useful metals is about 100 times that of the rest of the crust. Again, this isn't particularly surprising because of the hot spot and higher concentrations of sulfur helping to make these metals soluble. However, this would also lead me to expect to find higher concentrations of other metals that I haven't seen in the island's mineral veins yet, like titanium and especially nickel. Perhaps they've been here the whole time and I've just had difficulty identifying them. Or, more likely, they've been mixed in with the other metal ores, so nothing I've been working with so far has been entirely pure. Or they may just be rarer in this area of the crust for other complicated geological and chemical reasons that I don't know about. This should almost certainly be the case for aluminum, which should mostly be stored in the form of aluminum oxide minerals, which I would expect the sulfuric acid to have a hard time dissolving, though the high temperatures and pressures down there may help. Nevertheless, if the pattern holds, I should expect to see comparable amounts of neodymium to copper, which will be exciting to see, as it's a rare earth element that could allow me to produce very powerful permanent magnets, if I can figure out the correct alloys and manufacturing processes. By the same logic, it should take about a month to get a full plate of tungsten, tin, or uranium, and precious metals like silver, platinum, and gold would take 2 to 20 years, but again, this is all dependent on the relative abundance of these elements in this particular area of the Earth's crust, and how loose and convective the magma around here is. As a result, I expect those modules of the Electrofuge stack to be a little redundant, as they'll almost always be empty, depending on how long I stay here. And as much as the sulfur should help in the pocket immediately around the nozzle of the geothermal well, it really is less than a sneeze in the bucket compared to how much material is actually down there in the Earth. In any case, I removed the metal that had collected so far and left it in contact with the anode at the top of the stack to recycle those metals down into the solution so they could be separated from their neighbors more properly. I may have to do this several times as I calibrate the Electrofuge over the next week at least. Once that chore was done, I got started on the others, getting the solar tower cooking another batch of lime every hour while the sun was still shining. I did my forage and conducted my microbe separations before lunch, but I'm starting to see very marginal returns with each generation I select, suggesting to me that the microbes have just about finished specializing to my specifications, reminding me of the fact that every organism has a limited amount of diversity coded in its DNA. And even with something as prone to rapid mutations as these microbes, there was still a hard and practical limit to what natural and artificial selection could do with them. No matter how much time and pressure I put them under, I could never get them to produce, say, insulin, because the instructions for building those molecules just aren't there. Another reason I consider biological evolution to be impossible. Since I'm thinking about it, let's have some fun and do the math. If insulin is 51 amino acids long, and each of those amino acids is represented by a 3-nucleotide code in a given gene, then that's 150 base pairs to mutate at random at the same place and time in the microbe's DNA. Since there are 4 base pairs to choose from, that's a probability of 1 in 153 to the 4th power, or a 0.000000162% chance of creating that mutation at random. And if these mutations occur, say, every 10 generations, then it would take 5.5 billion generations for an organism to produce insulin at random. For something like a bacterium that goes through about 1,000 generations in a month, this would only take 457,000 years. And while this is nothing on evolutionary timescales, if you're a complex animal with generations that are more like a year or decades, it would take 5.5 to 55 billion years to get that kind of mutation. And the Earth is supposed to be only 4.5 billion years old. And yes, you could shortcut the process by copy-pasting genes with more than one nucleotide at a time, say with viruses, but that only helps if those genes already have pieces of the code you want, which still have to be built by random mutations in another organism, which does nothing to really change the probability. This doesn't even take into account generations probably growing more slowly or fewer surviving without that useful mutation, evading the organism's mutation correction systems long enough to create something useful, increasing the likelihood of creating a harmful mutation that kills the organism, leading to a dead end, and slowing down the cell's rate of reproduction while the junk DNA takes up space and resources, none of which natural selection looks kindly upon. For me at least, the math says no. But to play devil's advocate, always a good skill for a scientist to practice, that would be less of a problem if those more complex animals were regularly picking up new protein coding genes from bacteria, basically using them to do all of the evolutionary prototyping for them via horizontal gene transfer. What's more, I'm aware of some very interesting potential evidence for this having possibly occurred in brown recluse spiders, as some of the genes for their uniquely cytotoxic venom have only ever been observed in certain species of bacteria. Of course, to play the devil's advocate, the viruses would have to install those genes in the reproductive cells of an organism in order to be passed on, dividing the probability of random horizontal gene transfer by each of those billions or trillions of cells in the organism that don't get turned into the next generation, including those reproductive cells that are produced and discarded regularly over the course of the organism's lifetime, like human egg cells, or that don't even get to participate in meiosis, like the majority of sperm cells. So, unless there's a hitherto undiscovered mechanism for multicellular organisms that actively tests foreign DNA, like some kind of twisted inverse thymus, and integrates it into its reproductive cells before it even knows if those genes will do its offspring any good, I'm going to consider this pathway for evolution unlikely as well. Though perhaps this would make an interesting line of scientific inquiry and experimentation for someone of far greater biochemical expertise than I expect I'm ever likely to achieve under my current circumstances. Of course, the mystery still remains, however, of how the spider acquired those genes. Whether it randomly inherited them from a bacterium, or whether the creator decided to reuse a part between different models of his robots, I am far from equipped to speculate, and I've learned better than to be dogmatic about things I can't falsify. Nevertheless, I can understand why most scientists would dislike the intelligent design model. Because God made it that way is a boring explanation, and it kind of takes the fun out of trying to figure out how the universe works. As such, I think I've come to switch my personal mode of scientific inquiry from how did this come to be, which is interesting enough in its own right, to why did the creator make it the way he did, assuming an almost engineering rationale behind everything. For me, this turns science into a means by which I may, in some small capacity, begin to understand the mind of the creator by reverse engineering what he's created. I can tell I'm starting to ramble again, however. Returning to the subject at hand, all of this thought about generational mutations got me thinking about how I need to store my cultures such that I could produce food and keep the cultures growing continuously without deviating genetically or being contaminated by outside pathogens. The containers will need to be non-porous, abiotic, and transparent for the algae, so that inevitably means they'll need to be made out of some kind of glass bottles. However, at the same time, I'm going to need a way to bubble carbon dioxide and nitrogen into them without contaminating them. The first thing that comes to mind is a bottle with a long S-shaped neck, like that used for Louis Pasteur's pond water experiment for disproving spontaneous generation. If that jar could sit out in the open air uncontaminated for weeks, it should work fine for me, though I may also want to give it a longer, possibly coiled neck, and expose it to heat or UV radiation to kill any bacteria that might be transported with the airflow. Next, I would need to worry about getting the sugar water and oxygenated air out of the algae culture without draining the algae out of it or letting bacteria get in. This isn't going to be as easy as making a bacteria trap, because microbes would diffuse through the water rather than settling at the bottom of a channel. Positive pressure flow through a valve or nozzle would be the only way to minimize the risk of stuff getting in, and that would be easy enough to pull off as the algae cultures produce oxygen gas, or as pressurized air is bubbled into the bottle. To keep the algae themselves from getting out would require some kind of diffusion filter, and I don't think I can make one of those. Even an activated charcoal filter can't keep out bacteria. I remember studying cell lysis for an experiment a long time ago, and while I could theoretically make 1,000,000 tiny capillary tubes too small for bacteria to get through, that would be a lot of work, and if any bacteria did get through or rupture in the attempt, they might produce toxins in the process. Maybe I could try to make a membrane out of acetate film, which is made from cellulose, but I don't know the recipe, or if it's even permeable to sugar molecules. In the end, it may not even be necessary to separate the algae at all. If they're non-toxic, and if they're growing on the walls of the bottle, they should block light from reaching the center, meaning that fewer algae will be growing there anyway, and that's where I can collect the sugar water, though a series of settling tubes or a centrifuge might help keep their concentrations in the solution to a minimum. I might even be able to build the centrifuge into the function of the pressurized nozzle, where the water flow in and out of it forces the water to follow a circular path, kind of like in the Electrofuge, but forcing the heavy algae to the edge, where they may become caught in a series of baffles or something. I can duplicate this bottle setup for the yeast cultures, though with a twist. The main bottle will contain the algae and nitrogen-fixing bacteria needed to keep the yeast fed, while the yeast themselves will settle to the bottom of a long tube, which should mostly deplete the water of dissolved sugars and ammonia, while carbon dioxide and nitrogen rises back up the tube to keep the three cultures more or less separate, but still forming a small, self-sustaining microecology. The settled yeast culture can then be extruded from a nozzle in the same way as the sugar solution, and excess water pressed out of them through a grate or piece of cloth, kind of the same way cheese curds are separated. Finally, I need a way to maintain the selection pressure on these microbes continuously, otherwise they may revert back to the less specialized variants they used to be. This will be complicated by the fact that, especially for the yeasts, the ones I want to propagate will also be the ones I want to eat, but I suppose this is nothing new since the invention of agriculture. You'd think natural selection would have caused those plants in the early days to make themselves less edible or appetizing to humans and other animals, to keep themselves from being eaten, but the reverse happened, because the ones that got eaten had their seeds spread around, while the ones that didn't get eaten weren't spread around. If I want to replicate the same basic process, that implies I need, most of all, a choice between 2 or more bottles of cultures and a way to measure which one is doing the best. Then I might clean out the bottles and start over with the preferred culture, much like how I've been selectively breeding them so far. It would probably also help prevent the introduction of pathogens. However, this isn't something I can do every day, like I've been doing with the Petri dish cultures, otherwise it's going to take all my time every day just keeping this system maintained. I'd prefer something more automated. So what if I instead made something that was the opposite of Pasteur's pond water flask? Instead of keeping microbes out of a jar, it would let microbes in from an otherwise controlled environment. For example, the survival of algae in one jar may be made dependent on the amount of sugar they produce, perhaps using a lamp that becomes brighter the greater the resistivity of the water, and thus the sugar concentration, encouraging the growth of algae that excrete as much sugar as possible from as little light as possible. These algae may then spread in and out of the jar randomly to seed the main culture bottle, kind of like an appendix, which acts like a nuclear fallout bunker for gut microbes if you eat something that kills them all. Alternatively, electrogenic bacteria may be used to measure sugar levels instead, which otherwise won't contaminate the rest of the bottle because they'd have no electrodes to grow on and can't survive in aerobic conditions. The same could more or less be done with the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, measuring alkalinity through electrolytic reactions, and perhaps to a lesser extent with the yeasts through the detection of amino acids, or just by taste manually. But it occurs to me that this has to be a reward feedback loop, rather than a punishment one. For example, if I started heating the nitrogen fixers if the alkalinity got too low, there would be fewer of them to produce less ammonia, causing a runaway feedback that would kill them all. Instead, it should be more like increasing their drip feed in response to alkalinity, which would almost have to be through a capillary tube opened or closed by something swelling in response to heat. Complicated. Whatever the case, the purging cycle will probably have to be no longer than a week. Any sooner, and the cultures won't have time to fill the bottles and produce useful compounds. Any longer, and they might specialize for new conditions, or grow competing microbes. I'll also want to keep spare cultures on ice in the cellar, in case I need to re-inoculate the system. This more or less completes the design stage for this system. A coiled glass pipe for bubbling in air and exposed to sunlight, heat, and or covered in silver to trap and kill outside microbes, a pressurized jar the algae can grow on, an appendix jar that maintains a selection pressure on each culture through environmental feedback, assuming I can't just make that the entire jar, a centrifugal flow nozzle for extracting sugar water, and a long settling column and nozzle for extracting yeast. With a plan in place, I decided to spend the remainder of the afternoon using the kiln for glass blowing instead of lime production, and to make a single jar for each culture to act simultaneously as its natural selection chamber and growth/production vat. The algae bottle was simple enough, made very similarly to my soda bottles, but with multiple openings on the bottom and a domed top. I would have liked to have given it a bigger surface area so that more algae could grow on it, but I wasn't sure about its ability to resist gas pressures if I made its shape any more complex. I built a simple rubber valve on the end of one outlet nozzle for pouring out the sugar solution, which I can centrifuge later in a bowl on the potting wheel if I really need to. The nitrogen fixation bottle was a bit more complicated. While I could still control their growth by exposure to sunlight, I built the bottle's outlets onto its top, curving over so it can function as a distiller for the ammonia produced by the cultures in the bottle. The end had a valve on it that'll allow me to precisely control how much ammonia leaks into the next bottle, or to pour it out directly for my own use if I happen to be running low on ammonia again for nitric acid production, though I doubt that'll continue to be a problem. Both of these bottles will then have a drip feed into several long glass tubes containing the yeast cultures, the drip feeds preventing the yeast from climbing up the tubes and back contaminating the rest of the system. The manifold to which these tubes would be connected sloped downward, and itself will drip out any extra ethanol produced by the yeast cultures, and it is this that I intend to make the system measure, The electrical resistivity of the ethanol solution will control the intensity of the light feeding both the nitrogen and sugar-producing cultures, their survival thus being connected directly to the health and productivity of the yeast cultures. This may change, though, if I take some of the sugar or yeast away for my own use, but so long as it's not enough to completely kill all the cultures, it should only encourage them to be more productive. The nozzle at the end of each yeast tube will allow me to extract them for processing and eating, and each tube will contain a different, separated culture with a different flavor. The microbe trapping coil I made at the end of the day proved to be the most complicated, as I had to heat, extend, and twist the glass tube into a spiral slowly and carefully to make it work. I found myself breaking several tubes over the course of the afternoon, and it eventually began to dawn on me, in the midst of my growing frustration, that every additional step I had to take to try and manipulate this exceedingly fragile material increased the likelihood that it would break at one of those steps, forcing me to start over. Therefore, I realized that I needed to keep the number of shaping steps I took with my tubes and bottles to an absolute minimum, but this wasn't helped by the nature of my kiln, which could only apply heat to the glass across a large proportion of its surface at a time. This was good for shaping large bottles and long tubes, and especially for minimizing the buildup of mechanical stress in the glass as it cooled and shrank, but less so for welding smaller, more delicate tubes together, as the hot, taffy-like glass would tend to bend out of the way instead of fusing on many occasions, leaving the resulting glass parts misshapen or leaving holes in the attempted welds. This was also not helped by the large and clumsy nature of my tools, which were mostly made of flammable wood or brittle ceramic, and I kept wishing I had a little more iron available so I could build some simple pliers. I eventually concluded that for many of these more delicate operations, what I really needed was something like a blowtorch, and although there was no way for me to gain access to anything like propane or oxyacetylene here, I was reminded of a video I watched once describing some early scientific glass blowing tools, including a sort of blowtorch, which used a simple oil lamp in combination with a blowing tube to produce a small, directed flame for precisely heating small cross-sections of glass. I was in grave need of a break from this project anyway, so I went to the workshop and tried to put one together, repurposing one of my methanol lamps and hollowing out a small piece of bamboo for the blowing tube. It was, in many ways, trivially easy to make, which I needed after the repeated failures with the glass this afternoon, and I found that by connecting the blowing tube to the bellows and a small pressure manifold with a one-way valve and a spare balloon on it, I could maintain a steady stream of air to direct my glass-working flame, without having to hold the blowing pipe in my mouth. A small tripod for the lamp and a jointed arm to hold the blowing tube at a specific angle made the glassworking infinitely more comfortable and convenient, allowing me to finish in a short amount of time what I'd been unable to do all afternoon. I was still quite hot and tired at the end of the day, however, so I'll leave assembling and inoculating this system for tomorrow. Before I went to bed, however, I dipped some bamboo in latex for hoses to connect the different bottles and left them to dry for assembly tomorrow morning. Week 51, Day 6. There was a light shower this morning, which was kind of a relief, as I've sort of been holding my breath for another rainstorm with all this nice weather I've been having. I checked on the Electrofuge again when I got up, and made a few more adjustments to the coil resistances before doing one last separation procedure on the microbes. I then got the bottles and rubber hoses I prepared last night and began assembling the microbial food synthesis machine. Having had some time to sleep on it, I built a better valve for the sugar water, which had a little whirligig in it that spins as the water passes through it to keep the algae out, and a couple of little inflatable rubber plungers for the yeast cultures that'll help squeeze the water out of them before the yeast is extruded from the nozzle. It occurred to me as I was working on that I would need some way to get distilled, microbe-free water into the tubes somehow to replenish them. But I quickly figured out that I could make the trap coil double as a distilling coil for vaporized water, which would also probably provide both the pressure necessary for continuous airflow into the bubbler and the heat necessary to kill any microbes trying to get into the system. Next, I used some of my spare copper film to build a couple of electrolytic transistors for the feedback sensors. I changed my mind and decided to give each culture its own independent sensor and light source, because I was worried that if they weren't receiving feedback for exactly the features I was looking for, they might develop new traits that still technically achieve the survival conditions. I want one culture to make sugar, so it'll measure the ethanol output of the yeast. I want the other culture to make ammonia, or at least ammonium ions, so it will measure the conductivity of the water. Once I was done building these circuits, with a little spare copper, zinc, resistors from the Electrofuge project, and spare light bulbs, I assembled the apparatus, filled it with autoclaved water, and inoculated the bottles with the relevant cultures. Given that I'd originally designed this as part of a life support system for astronauts and spacecraft, it would probably work best in the underwater dome, where the light is already pretty dim, and it could augment the oxygen production of the rest of the garden. For now, though, I mounted it in the kitchen where I could keep an eye on it for the first week or two of operations, and where it'll make more sense to collect and store the materials it produces. Maybe I can build a second apparatus for the dome later if I really want to. While I was in the kitchen, I made lunch, and with no more pressing activities, I decided to spend the remainder of the afternoon writing. As I said, I've kind of gotten tired of the Half-Life writing project, and I decided to take a break from it and write something that made me feel a little better, because Half-Life is a pretty intense story. I thought it would be nice if I could maybe make another game that I could play to keep me occupied during lulls in activity. But aside from the various ones I've already thought of that don't really seem to fit here, given that my life has basically become a survival crafting game, there was really only one other game I really missed and wanted to see again: A Hat in Time. However, I couldn't really make it into a book, at least not directly, because it's a puzzle platformer. If I took some artistic liberties, I might have been able to make it into a book, as it's very much the little characters that I love most, basically fan fiction. Still, I didn't think that would entirely capture the same feeling that comes from trying over and over again and finally succeeding. Then a slightly crazy thought crossed my mind. What if I tried to make an actual video game? Obviously, I don't have a computer or anything to run one on, but maybe I could replicate the mechanics of something like a simple 2D platform, using something more analog. I remember from watching a few game design videos that often these games will scroll the background instead of the character, which would be easy enough to do with an actual scroll. At that point, all you'd need is a way to hold the character in the center and make them move up and down to jump. I can imagine using a little flicker like the paddles on a pinball machine. I could then put some kind of textures on the surface of the scroll to make platforms the character can stand on, and maybe enemies that can be slid down into a pocket by jumping on them, almost like a sort of pop-up book. Perhaps they could deal damage to a player by forming an incline, or having some kind of spring on them, such that they knock the player character off the plane they're sitting on and down into a catch basin at the bottom of the screen, where you have to return the scroll to a previous position to fish them out along an inclined plane, operating functionally like a checkpoint. I spent some time making designs for what ended up looking like some kind of primitive handheld game console, before getting started with a little bit of prototyping, just to see if the basic mechanics would work. Making the scrolling backdrop was pretty easy. Just a little paper glued to a couple of sticks with resin to make a blank scroll. Then I used a couple of pieces of bamboo to build a simple square frame, the ones on the sides being hollow for the scroll to slide into and be rotated from, and a slot at the top of the frame for the scroll to slide into, almost like a game cartridge. A couple of knobs and some rubber brakes to keep them under tension made for a simple back and forth control. Next, I carefully cut a couple of square panes of glass to protect the scroll on both sides of the frame, grinding the edges smooth when I was done for safety. In the process, I also realized that I could make the scrolls double-sided and store more game on them if I wanted to, like old cassette tapes. Next, there was the tricky subject of making the player character work. At first, I just used a little flat piece of bark that I could squeeze and slide around easily between the panes, and added a little paddle to the bottom frame that I could pull back and release to make it jump. However, I quickly realized this wasn't going to work, because the flicker couldn't reach the character once they were on a platform. I also couldn't get the character to stand still in the center of the screen very easily. Instead, it just slid all the way to one side of the screen until it bumped into the edge, which made it hard to respond to approaching obstacles. I considered putting a thin glass rail on either side of the character to restrict their movement, but this would not only have been easy to see, kind of disrupting suspension of disbelief, but the edges of the rails would have torn up the scroll eventually. Then I got the idea to basically flex the glass panes just a tiny bit, so they pinched together at the ends and bowed out in the center. This actually created a better movement scheme than I was originally planning on, because it gave the character a little wiggle room when the background was being scrolled back and forth, in addition to giving them room to slide up and down. This didn't fix the jumping problem though, and at first, I tried to get around this by just quickly shaking the console up and down, or turning it upside down, because there was nothing to really stop me from cheating that way, though it did occur to me that this could be the basis for other kinds of gameplay for movement on a horizontal plane instead of a vertical one. Still, it didn't really capture the springy, jumping feel I was after, so I played around with different options to somehow build the jumping mechanism into the character sprite itself, like a little pogo stick, though it was hard to make something that small and mechanical out of wood without making it delicate. I eventually settled on simply making some rounded edges on the sides of the character sprite that would cause it to slip up or down quickly when the bottom or top of the screen was squeezed, kind of like when you squeeze on one side of a wet bar of soap. As such, I was careful to make the sprite out of something that wasn't hard enough to scratch the glass, but also smooth enough that it would slip when squeezed. Polishing a piece of wood with a little resin, while counterintuitive because resin is usually sticky, seemed to do the trick. One final thing I wanted to do was make the character turn around when the scrolling direction was reversed. I found that I could sort of pull this off by giving the glass panes a little more give where they were attached to the frame, and by applying a little rubber to the vertical edges of the sprite on one side of each face, so it would catch the paper and get twisted around as the direction reversed. At that point, it was relatively easy to introduce the various platforming elements to the scroll and test them, starting with static platforms at various levels and vertical walls that create simple mazes. To my delight, I found that I didn't even need to make many adjustments to make the character sprite stick to the side of the vertical walls for an instant for wall climbing jumps. I just sandwiched the sprite between the vertical wall and the flexed glass rail, which provided just enough friction for the character to stay up against the wall, but not enough to stick to it, so they slowly slid down. I didn't have the reflexes, though, to rotate the scroll and jump at the same time, but I think I can fix that by adding some buttons later. Next, I added some environmental hazards like spike traps, which just formed an inclined plane that the player sprite slid off of to a level below, and into the tray on the bottom of the screen. At this point, I realized it was possible for the player to do a double jump, or even an infinite number of jumps, to try and stay out of the pit, but it was not easy. I gave the same treatment to enemy sprites, where they were inclined on either end, so the player would slip off the platform if they tried to get past them, but flat on the top, so they could be jumped on, and slid down into a pocket inside the background scroll, putting a little inclined plane below them. A paper peg or switch on the side frame caused them to be slid back out of the pocket when the scroll was unwound, like they were respawning off screen. These made for good static hazards, but it was kind of tricky to make dynamic ones. One way I thought of to do this was to give the pockets some room for the enemies to slide back and forth, and a little latex to make them stick to the panes a little. In this way, they would drag on the pane and move in the same direction as the player, as though running away. I can already see how this could have interesting puzzle applications, but it's also not the vibe I'm going for, as I don't want Hat Kid to be the aggressor. Instead, I could reverse this behavior by putting the enemy on the end of a hidden lever, which would cause them to move in the opposite direction of the character sprite, as though attacking or defending their area. This gives me ideas for a whole slew of other simple dynamic behaviors I could build into these sprites, like jumping when the player jumps to block them, springy platforms to increase the player's jump height, platforms that slide away when the player jumps on them, etc. But I soon found myself running out of time, and had to stop and get ready for bed. Hopefully, I'll have plenty of time to play with this tomorrow, since it's Sabbath. Week 51, Day 7. The rain picked up again, but that was okay. I had things to do indoors. I checked on the Electrofuge again in the morning, and I think I've got the iron plating pretty much sorted out. Copper's next, and fortunately I've gotten a head start on that one. I also checked on the food synthesizer, but as I expected, it hadn't been given enough time to grow much yet. Maybe another day or two. After that, once it was light enough out, I started playing again with my pieces of paper to develop more game mechanics and give them a more artistic touch, getting real Paper Mario vibes as a result. I also started fiddling with some more sophisticated controls. Specifically, I carved some ratchets into the scroll wheels and used some small sticks and wooden springs so I could press a button and rotate the scroll wheel a fixed amount, though I was still able to rotate it manually for finer control. I found this particularly useful for when I needed the character to move a certain distance in a short amount of time. As I was working on this, I realized there was no mechanic for grabbing onto ledges, so I made a tiny hook on the end of the character sprite, where the hand was, that could hook onto the narrow paper ledges. I could then subsequently make the character jump to get over them. Next, I carved out a little cover and buttons, so now it looks like an actual control surface. I took a break to listen to the sermon on the radio and perform my Bible transcriptions before going down to the dome to tend the garden, feed the sharks, and have lunch. I really do think another food synthesis machine would be an asset down there, but I'll have to put it on my to-do list for another day. When I was done in the dome, I came back to base and decided to spend the rest of the afternoon working on my little game console. I started by making a full-length scroll and sketching out the first level. Part of me wanted to repeat the original A Hat in Time game verbatim, and another part of me wanted to take it in a slightly different direction. For now, I just worked on making a simple level that iterated on the main mechanics of jumping, climbing, and navigating the level. The extended tutorial method is generally how good games are made, as I understand it, with each level adding a new mechanic, teaching it to you, and then mixing it together with others you've already learned in different combinations to make more complicated puzzles. Kind of strikes me as an optimal way to teach any subject, which is why I always loved the idea of using video games for education. For the moment, I just focused on passive platforming elements, drawing them out like reusable game assets and attaching them to the page: a platform, a wall, a gap. There were already so many combinations you could stick these objects together in to create an interesting game before adding anything complicated. At the same time, though, it still felt like it was missing something important. It just wasn't the same without music, so I got the idea to add music to the device by making it into something like a music box. I had plenty of thin iron plates available, so I spent a little time with a smooth rock, hammering one of the plates as flat and smooth as I could, before gently cutting grooves into it of progressively greater length, to effectively create a tiny finger harp, carefully testing and tuning the tones as I went so it would stay in pitch. Because it was made from relatively soft, pure iron, it'll probably need case hardening later. As for a way to play it, the easiest thing would be to put grooves or something in the scroll itself, like a player piano, but that would result in the music only playing when the character moves. I'm going to have to make a separate cylinder or scroll that moves freely from the rest of the scroll, and a little wind-up mechanism to drive it, but that should be easy enough to hide in the gutter where the player sprite falls if they're damaged. As for the playing cylinder itself, I had the idea to make it by simply wrapping a sheet of iron around a small stick or piece of bamboo and cutting vertical grooves into it, which will basically play every single note at the same time at the same rate. However, the paper scroll I'll wrap over it will have gaps cut in it, so it'll only play a note at the time and place where the gap is, while effectively muting all the others. Again, this will require some case hardening to be effective, so I scored the iron roller and set it aside for now. I got back to the level design at that point, and then spent some time play testing it. For something so simple, it was still pretty fun, as well as fiddly and random in ways that a digital game isn't, which is both frustrating in some ways, as the character will sometimes do things you don't expect, and fun in others, as it forces you to think on your feet and use quick reflexes. It still needs more work and adjustment. Frankly, I should probably replace a lot of the wooden components with metal, now that I have some to work with, as they will be able to withstand greater punishment from inevitable button mashing. I just wasn't expecting this to be what I'd be using my new metal supply for first.
Jump in the air, let's get that timepiece. Don't be afraid, 'cause I won't let you fall. We'll try again and again until we finally get them all.
I also pulled the and I could see little bits of silver coating the tips on the No, that's collecting, not coating. And put them in the solar kiln to set while the sun was still out. That's a bit of an alliteration, isn't it? And the rotational velocities on the drums, not the dromes, whatever the heck a drome is, that I haven't seen in the island's mineral veins yet. I guess that's the sound of me running out of oxygen. As a result, I expect those modules of the Electrofuge SPAC, whatever that is, without that useful mutation.
And no matter where I roam, I will find my way home and maybe make some new friends. so the adventure never ends. Now, after that little diversion, where the heck did I leave off? Let's just start at the beginning of this little paragraph here, shall we? So that inevitably means, excuse me, pause to adjust screen brightness, where water will flow in and out of, where the water flowing in and out of it forces it to follow. Where the water flow in and out of it forces, and excess water pressed out of them through a grate or piece of cloth, kind of the same way cheese curds are separated. Thinking about cheese again. For example, the survivor, and itself will drip out, and itself will drip, and itself that often these grains, because resin is usually sticky. Mouse, come back here. That the player I took a break to so I got the idea to add music to the device. Hey there, thanks for listening all the way to the end, especially since this is one of the longer ones. A lot happened this week. Finishing the Electrofuge, building the food synthesizer, and now a handheld game console. Hopefully, I'll be able to put a proverbial bow on all of my projects next week, before the end of the year. So, if you want to see how that turns out, you can press the like and subscribe buttons to get notified as soon as the next episode is ready. Now, it's the end of the year, and I'm coming to the end of what I have prepared for this project. I've got a few ideas for ways the story might continue, but that kind of depends on you. So, if you want to help me out with that, please share this video with someone who you think would enjoy it. And consider pressing the like button to tell the algorithm to do a little bit of that sharing for you. Also, if you'd like to share some of your own thoughts, stories, and perspectives on the episode, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. I'd like to head off any potentially nasty arguments about creationism and evolution first, though. I think both models have holes and merits to them, and I've learned not to be dogmatic about things that are hard to falsify, and not to go looking for a debate, even a healthy one, until I'm content with being wrong. All that said, thanks again for listening, and hope to see you here again next week.